There are locations in the world that some might consider weird. Sure, there are usually haunted houses and old cemeteries that may or may not be supernatural, but no one can truly understand the events at Smithson's Farm. Smithson's Farm was a place not even the bravest of people would go. It was hard to call the skeptics truly skeptical when they refused to set foot in the place. The origin of Smithson's Farm is not exactly known, but its history was enough to write a book. The first case dates back to 1959. The Smithson Farm was inherited by John and Mabel DSmitson along with their 4 children. John inherited the farm from his grandfather, who died of tuberculosis. John's grandfather, Henry, could be described as a good man. He was a hard worker and cared for the farm as much as he cared for his family. For many decades Henry lived on the farm, although it was never known whether he owned the farm or inherited it himself. During the last days of Henry's life, he was hysterical. In his hospital room, he kept yelling about holes in the fields and hands rising out of the ground. Until his death, it was never known what he meant. This continued until John inherited the farm. The neighbors were not as favorably disposed toward these Smithsonians as they were toward Henry. John was described as a raging drunkard. Mabel was a shouty and burdensome woman. The Smithsons' 3 sons were troubled teenagers who skipped school and partied on the farm. Smithson's only daughter was a withdrawn and spoiled child. The police were called to the Smithson Farm almost daily. The Smithsons were not known for anything from domestic violence to noise complaints. This continued until the night of June 12, 1961. Around midnight, neighbors heard Mabel Smithson screaming and yelling coming from the fields. She was naked and red-faced. She seemed to be in unspeakable hysterics. The situation quickly turned grim when it was discovered why she was acting this way. A few days before, Mabel's favorite cat, Whiskey, had gone missing. Mabel speculated that perhaps John had something to do with it. Just that evening, as Mabel was taking a late-night shower, she heard a faint meow from the bathroom window. She didn't even have time to get dressed before she ran outside. At that moment a horrible sight appeared before her. Mabel found Whiskey, but he was completely skinned. Not that his fur had been shaved off. Whiskey's skin was completely peeled off. It was as if he'd been skinned clean off. The worst part was that the poor thing was still alive. When Mabel saw this, she became desperate. She began to scream into the night, blaming John. For safety, Mabel spent the night at the police station. John took his rifle and put the poor kitten out of her misery. Who could have committed such a horrible act? No animal or human should have to go through such a horrible ordeal. The next event will take place on March 3, 1962 at 10 a.m. After shots rang out, police were called to the Smithson Farm. When they arrived on the scene, John Smithson was in the backyard. He was an incoherent mess. He was yelling about a well on the farm. He claimed to have witnessed every member of the Smithsons being dragged into the well. He talked about black oily swirls coming out of the well and pulling Mabel down. That night she went to check the coops after hearing the noise. John was watching from the window. He jumped up and tried to warn the kids, but they were already gone. They weren't in bed where he had last seen them. The shots rang out after John stated that they were back, but it wasn't them. He talked about something in the well that took his family and then pretended to be them. Police assumed John had had a mental breakdown and executed all of Smithson's family members and dumped their bodies in a well on the farm. John was later sentenced to prison time. The rest of the Smithsons members were never found, although attempts were made to get them out of the well. Although they tried, authorities noted that the well never seemed to end. For nearly 2 decades, the Smithson Farm was a desolate mass of land. Local residents began to suspect that the Smithson Farm was cursed. The next event would not occur until 1982. By this point, the Smithson Farm was in a virtually abandoned state. It remained that way until the property was purchased by Ed Smith Mining, a mining company that at the time was based primarily in New York City. Late that fall, Ed Smith sent a team of 20 men to the Smithson Farm in hopes of harvesting the rich soil. Although Smithson had a cursed reputation, the place produced some of the best crops ever seen. By this point, most of the neighbors had left. Smithson was officially a deserted strip of land, 15 men disappeared one November night during a 30-minute overnight break. The manager returned and found 15 of his employees missing and 4 lying on the ground nearly dead. Of the 4 remaining, none could remember exactly what had happened. The only thing they could figure out was that the team had heard strange noises coming from one of the freshly dug holes. One of the men had been the first to go to investigate, but had been gone too long. Eventually the worker returned, but he looked strange. The worker called to the others to follow him to the hole. It was then that the 4 remaining workers disappeared. The missing 19 workers were never found and were never heard from again. Ed Smith Mining declared bankruptcy in 1990 after the families of the missing workers filed a lawsuit against the company. To this day, the Smithson Farm remains untouched and unexplored. That takes us back a few months. I worked for a paranormal research group. For safety reasons, my name and the names of my coworkers have been changed. A few months before, we were preparing for a 3-day hike and exploration of the Smithson Farm. If there really was something cursed at the farm, we were going to find out. Finally that day came. The team for the exploration consisted of Dave, Ashley, Hector, Rob, and myself. Dave was the leader of the research as he had the most experience in researching paranormal places. Ashley was new to research but had ambition that couldn't be found anywhere else. Hector was the oldest in the group. He had joined the team hoping that at least something would break his skepticism of the paranormal. Rob was a tough guy, but he was tough as long as you stayed on his side. We arrived at the farm toward evening. The place was a dusty old mess. I never thought I could call this place depressing, but it was completely devoid of joy and life. The first thing Dave noticed was the eerie silence. Nothing could be heard but the dry blowing of the dusty air. There were no birds, no insects, no cars passing by. Just complete and utter silence. No living thing had set foot on this land in years. The farm was an abandoned purgatory, lost in time. Something here wrong, Ashley said. This place scares the hell out of me. That's for sure, Hector said. This place hypnotizes me. I had heard of this place, but I had never set foot in its territory. Seeing it with my own eyes was far more interesting than any fairy tales. Daylight is fading, people. Let's get moving, Dave ordered. He simply outlined the nature of our mission. We were to explore the infamous well, the same one mentioned in the John Smithson case. Dave's plan was to attach an underwater camera to a thick cable and lower it down the well. Our plan was to see if we could find something the police could never find. If John Smithson's story had any weight, the bodies of Smithson's family members might still be in that well, if they were there at all. While Dave, Hector and Rob set up the line and camera for the well, Ashley and I explored the Smithson's farm and living quarters. There was nothing of interest in the house. The house was completely empty for the most part. The only thing left were a few old kitchen appliances. The barn was no different. The place was mostly empty except for the farm equipment that had been left behind. Ashley noticed one thing, however. There was a strange trail in the dirt that led from the barn to a filled-in hole near the structure. The trail looked fresh. Too fresh. What was even more eerie was that the trail didn't look like it had been left by a person. It was strange and disorganized. In some places the road was serpentine. In other places it started to resemble an insect. Ashley took pictures for notes. However, I couldn't avoid worrying about what might have caused this trail. It was already 8 p.m. The line was ready to go. I set up the tents and illuminated the scene with spotlights. It was going to be a long night. Hector placed the camera on the edge of the well. On Dave's command, the camera began to lower. We have a vision, Ashley confirmed as the video from the camera appeared on her laptop. It's too dark. Turn on night mode, Dave asked. Ashley activated night mode on her laptop and the camera continued to lower. So far, there was nothing strange. All I could see were the walls of the well. Now we're down to a depth of 20 feet, Ashley said. The artificial stone walls of the well continued onward. It's a little strange that the well goes that deep. Dave looked at me like I sounded like an idiot. I probably did in his mind. We've gone down 40 feet, Ashley said. By this point we were starting to see moisture on the walls. Something was a little off though. A strange black slurry was starting to appear in places. At first glance you'd think it was mold or dirt, but it wriggled slightly as the camera passed over it. "What is that?" I asked. "Probably just worms. They're decomposers, you know. Maybe they ate something dead down there," Rob said. "We went down to 80 feet. Ashley looked confused. 80? What happened to 60? I asked. "I don't know. The camera missed the marker completely. It's just a glitch." "Keep going," Dave said. Hector and Rob continued to lower the rope. By now the walls were no longer stone. The walls were a mixture of blackened dirt and strange black mud. At this point, the camera suddenly stopped. "Why did you guys stop?" Dave asked. "We didn't. I think we hit something," Rob said. Even though the camera wasn't showing anything, we were still staring at the same muddy slurry. The signal began to appear and disappear. For a split second the screen changed to something else. "Ashley, pause the live feed and play it again," Dave said. Ashley did so, and sure enough, for a millisecond something appeared. Ashley made several attempts before she managed to pause the image. It was a black screen with a few simple words on it. "What are you searching?" Upon seeing this, everyone stopped. "Well, this is weird," Hector said. "What do we do about it?" Rob asked. It's just interference. Satellite interruptions. Just keep going. It's got nothing to do with us," said Dave. Dave was absolutely terrified. I could see it in his face. After fiddling with the wire for a bit, the camera started to descend again. "We're down to 280 feet, Ashley said in a shaky voice. For the first time during the entire descent, the sound of the camera picked up something. At first it was a slight noise, but the lower we descended, the louder it got. Soon we could clearly hear what it was. It was the painful meow of a cat. The sound was clearly a cat sound, but it sounded distorted. I could only describe it as if something that was not a cat was desperately trying to sound like one. Through it all we descended lower and lower. Eventually, the meow began to sound less animal and more human-like. The cat screams began to sound like the screams of a person. Several people. The voices were screaming in unison. By now, Ashley was ready to get the hell out of here. I was the same way. Rob was trying his best to stay calm, but I could see he was on the verge of going insane. The night vision didn't see anything else. It was just darkness. Words and phrases began to appear on the screen. "Mabel, Bobby, Sam. Above, Joshua, Whiskey. They're part of US now. You can be a part of US too." The camera recording was completely turned off. The camera remained off for several minutes. Suddenly Hector and Rob screamed as the cable began to drop rapidly. Something was pulling the camera, and pulling hard. Rob tried to grab the cable, but it burned his hands. The cable had reached its limit. The end of the cable, stuck in the ground, abruptly popped out and flew straight into the well. "No!" "The camera!" Dave shouted. The camera recording came back. The depth of the camera showed -340. The camera seemed to be elsewhere. Something had picked up the camera and held it for a few seconds. The last set of messages appeared on the screen. "Dave, Ashley, Rob, Hector, warning, don't be afraid. We can keep you safe. Here." The camera turned to show what was holding it. What we saw made us all visibly pale. There was a grotesque mixture looking into the camera. We saw something that looked like a combination of 3 women, 4 men, a cat, and several other creatures. They were all covered in a layer of black liquid. They were smiling into the camera in unison. The camera cut off for good. Suddenly we heard something moving quickly down the well. We all ran to the van as fast as we could. We didn't care about our stuff or each other. We jumped in the car and hit the gas like there was no tomorrow. In the rearview mirror we saw a hideous mass following us on thin, insect-like legs. It was silent the whole way. All of us were in shock. We had just discovered something horrible at the Smithsonian Farm, but all the evidence there had just been abandoned. When something like this happens, you don't think about evidence or conspiracy. All you have on your mind is survival. I gave up on paranormal investigations after that. I think we all quit. I never heard from any of them again. I guess they just moved away and found other jobs. I never saw or heard mention of the Smithson Farm again. Frankly, I don't think I want to know anything about it. If it were up to me, I would order the military to go there and burn the place to the ground. There are things in this world that the human eye cannot comprehend. What was in that well? What happened to it? I came up with a few theories as to what it could have been. For one thing, I thought there were some kind of body-snatching aliens living underneath the Smithson Farm. My other theory was that the well could have been some sort of portal to hell. It's unlikely I'll ever know what it was. Nevertheless, I'll leave it with a simple message. If you ever come across a place called Smithson's Farm, stay away from it. Smithson's Farm is a place lost in time. It remains a desolate blind spot in the eyes of God, and that is the way it should remain. Whatever you do, let Smithson's Farm rot.